Sage advice. Captain Stockton talked to him about remote control in depth. He had built some of his own collection from scratch. They spoke more than Tigrid spoke with Dr. Tombrock or any of his grandparents, and, in a way, more than with Rupert and Annabelle. They felt no jealousy, but they found it sad about the grandparents. They had had mid-level, unexciting careers in sales companies and had little to offer Tigrid except birthday and Christmas presents. When they visited, they couldn't take part in any of his interests. All they could do was look in wonder at the projects Tigrid had done. Rupert did not think it was necessary to monitor the calls with the captain, but he overheard one conversation that stood out. He had been about to go into the project room to talk to Tigrid when he heard them talking, and he stopped to listen. He had done so before, just as Dr. Tombrock had suggested. "I'm happy you want to be a pilot, Tigrid, but you don't want a war to go along with it. I knew a lot of guys who went down in those planes." "Yeah." "I didn't want to be a pilot either. I wanted to be an engineer, which is what I am now." "I know." "You know how I got to be an engineer?" "Hard work." "Yes, but I also never told anybody. No one would have believed me. I wasn't too good at math, and we were a farming family. It was out of character." "They wanted you to be a farmer?" "Yes and no. I could do something else if I wanted, but I would have looked stupid if I said I wanted to be an engineer. My friends would have teased me, and I know my brothers and sisters would have laughed. The point is, if you have a really big goal, keep it to yourself. You'll just have people saying you can't do it, it's a stupid idea, it'll never work, things like that." "Uh-huh." "So I didn't advertise it, that's all." "I already have advertised it." "There's nothing wrong with sharing your goals, but if it is going to come true, it will happen without any bragging or big promises. Sometimes those just get in the way, and your goals can change." "Yeah." "I'm not telling you what to do, just think about it." Rupert went in and joined the conversation with a renewed respect for the captain. Without him, he didn't know what Tigrid would be like. He'd been a pole star for him. Rupert could hardly believe they had kept up their conversations so long. He knew some of it was that they had something specific to do. In fact, projects were 90% of what they talked about. And if it wasn't those, it was engineering in general. Things like how buildings stood up against wind, how development processes went. And he did so more than he did with Rupert. There was something very steadying in Captain Stockton, more so than with Dr. Tombrock or anyone else. Sometimes Rupert thought Dr. Tombrock was really his and Annabelle's counselor, not Tigrid's. He wondered if Tigrid would have done just as well without him. Rupert asked whether they could come visit in Indiana that summer, and Captain Stockton couldn't have been happier to say yes. They decided they would drive, just as they had before. The whole of July would be on the road. They could retrace their steps from before, and they would not have to mask up for the plane. They could take a new route on the way home. Tigrid couldn't wait. An excursion to the past. Driving back across America was like respooling tape. Tigrid wanted to visit each and every one of their earlier stops, and he was pensive and calm as he followed the same paths, balanced on the same rocks, and observed the same exact stars in each place as he had before, as though he had left them there to be collected again later. Remarkably, he could comment on which stars were not yet visible on the horizon on this July trip compared to the ones they had seen in August years before. He looked longingly out the window when they turned north off I-70 in St. Louis to go to the Stocktons, as if their old home were almost visible in the distance. Captain Stockton greeted Tigrid with a copy of a book by the ancient Roman writer Vitruvius called De Architectura, the classic work of all things engineering. It all begins here, he told Tigrid as he opened the present. Everything you encounter in engineering has a deep foundation in these pages. These are 2 books. Is one in Latin? Yes. Are you going to learn Latin? I might. Tigrid flipped through its pages. What about the Egyptians? You'll find no writing from them directly. This book is all you'll need. He read a little of the book every day as he was there. He didn't understand much, even in English, but the captain told him it had been around for 2,000 years and it could wait a few more. But the captain also told him about what was in it as they did their other projects: bridges, viaducts, roads, towers, arches, military equipment, and Roman concrete and other materials, including when to use stone and when to use wood. They talked about scouting building locations, determining the best course for aqueducts and roads, and even how to design a theater for good acoustics. One time, Tigrid said, I can't believe we knew all this so long ago, before anything modern. We is the right choice of words, Tigrid. Listen to Vitruvius long enough, and he will feel like a friend. It will be like the 3 of us are all here together. They spent the greatest part of their time with the captain's collection of remote control planes. Among his collection was a hand-built replica B-17, about 4 feet long, and he taught Tigrid not just how to fly the planes, but the details of how they worked. Their main project was to finish assembling an F-16, 3-foot wingspan, which the captain had been working on for months. They got it out for its first run when Tigrid was there. Meanwhile, the captain told him a lot about aeronautics. Tigrid learned why some planes had wings attached to the top of the plane, while most had them attached to the bottom. Tigrid was especially interested in why Soviet planes used upward-mounted wings more often than others, and he wanted to know how jets were invented and what the spruce goose was. They had talked about many things over Zoom, of course, but there was much more to learn in person. Tigrid thought to himself how it was the mirror image of his experience with school. He had learned more when he was at home than he did in school, but that was because he could ignore the screen most of the time. There was never a shortage of new topics with the captain, and as their departure grew near, Tigrid asked if they could skip going back to Ohio and stay a few more days with the Stocktons. Rupert and Annabelle didn't need any persuasion. They had been hopeful he might finally have gotten over his nostalgia for Ohio, and they were not bothered that Tigrid did not change his mind. When finally the day came to leave, it was with a heavy heart on all sides. The Schauts thanked the Stocktons profusely, and the Stocktons returned their regards. Captain Stockton saluted Tigrid as they drove away, and Tigrid, struggling against his seatbelt, craned his neck back and returned the gesture. Miles down the road, Annabelle found a note in her purse from Mrs. Stockton. Henry forbade me to tell you, it said, but he's been happier than I have seen him in 30 years. As you know, that is when our son died. Tigrid has returned light to his life at last, and I will be forever grateful. The End of Boyhood. As life tends to do, time sped up, and it wasn't long before Tigrid was turning into a young man, almost in middle school. He had, thank goodness, become a normal boy. They sent him to the Stocktons for a week every summer, alone on the plane, and he returned every year with renewed purpose and vigor, and more to say about Vitruvius. The Schauts took great pride that their son would talk about this obscure writer with their adult friends. He was probably the only boy in California who could do so, and they smiled when Tigrid scolded them that Vitruvius was anything but obscure. In Dr. Tombrock's sessions, Tigrid's complaints about elements of the system became more articulate and less emotional. Even his invective against the insurance companies became formulaic, as if it were a settled and somewhat boring point of dissatisfaction for him. "He's letting all that go," said the doctor. "As for having a few pet peeves, that's normal. Lots of people don't like lawyers or the speed limit or Congress. It's just one aspect of his personality. It's best to acknowledge it and try not to fight it." Rupert and Annabelle did not belabor the fact that Tigrid had his complaints about all three of the doctor's examples. They came to the consensus that the meetings could end, and Tigrid took his leave politely at their last meeting and never asked for him again. He continued his work with remote control planes and tried to expand his abilities to model rockets. They were not as practical a toy as the planes, but he was able to get them to go in circles and could roughly guide them toward targets if he was in a large field, such as at the high school on Sundays. He returned to cars, trying to get them to respond as a coordinated group. This was challenging because terrain could affect cars in different ways, and he knew he would need some form of AI in each one to perform course corrections to remain as a group. "Will you do that with planes next?" his father asked. "I don't know," said Tigrid. "One thing at a time." He began studying computer languages, far beyond the coding they did in school. He had a very vague cloud of thought hovering over him at all times. He didn't know how he would use AI exactly, but he knew he would need to understand code from the ground up. He had to start at the beginning, like with Vitruvius. Ink bombs and billy clubs. When middle school started, Tigrid was unafraid of its reputation and suffered none of the stereotypical problems. He was self-assured, he wasn't a target of teasing, and he held up well in sports. Once, a boy called him a geek, but Tigrid took care of that with an ink bomb in his backpack. Each purple smudge that spread all over the boy's hands, face, hair, clothes, doors, the sink, and everywhere else bore witness to his failure. Tigrid was not targeted again. He even had the opportunity to defend someone, just the way they had been encouraged to do in health class. Randall had been getting harassed by a couple of the boys, who, of course, called him brain-damaged and uncoordinated. Tigrid obtained a short billy club and kept it in his bag. Once, as they were approaching Randall, he sneaked up from behind and whacked each one twice in the back of the leg, one after the other. Tigrid had heard bruises don't show there. He hit them unnecessarily hard and made sure to get some of the bone on the side of the leg by the knee. They fell and squealed as if unable to get their breath out. Tigrid stood over them and said, "I'll get expelled, and I'll probably go to juvie. But if you ever say anything to him ever again, it's going to be your heads. And then we'll see who has brain damage." He excelled in his classes, and the others had gotten too used to it to be jealous. Tigrid, for his part, made no disparaging comments. He had learned, on the internet, that popular kids weren't the stereotypical bullies or arrogant football captains he had thought. They excelled at something, and they were genuinely nice. But they had the potential for violence, even if they never used it. He was satisfied he had played his cards right. The plane. His teachers, who gave him ringing endorsements, had only one subject of concern. He seemed to withdraw from friendships, and he preferred working alone rather than in groups. If they asked him why, he would say that no one else did any work. It was hard to complain. He always had extra projects he was working on, and he would not object if someone wanted to take part, but he also didn't encourage it, and they never stayed for long. Rupert listened to the teachers and gently reminded Tigrid that Jay used to be a good friend, and that it was Jay who got him started on model airplanes in the first place. They used to work together all the time. "And remember," he said, "how you kept him as a friend even when he couldn't keep up with you? "I was just a kid then," said Tigrid. "I don't care if he joins, but I need to get these things done, not just fool around." Annabelle said, "Tigrid, I know I've said this before, but if you're helpful, others will help you too." That was the first time Tigrid actually heard it. To be popular, he would have to spread some help around too. And so he did make the effort to join groups, even if it slowed him down. It was an investment, and he had made it work for him in more ways than one. It was an investment, and he made it work for him in more ways than one. In the spring of 8th grade, the class was supposed to make solar-powered cars, and he managed to be more helpful while also getting it finished faster. His strategy was to slap a really bad prototype together very quickly, then make the final machine he had in mind anyway. His group got an A, and he had time to work on his own project. He brought in odd-looking parts that were mysterious to the others, and they lost interest in them quickly. The parts were the final components for something he showed only to his parents. He had made a plane that could take off by itself. He got it going, then just lifted his hands away from the controls. It took off and entered a holding pattern. Next, it will pretty much land by itself. Watch. It can't really do it yet, but it does some of it. He only had to make a few adjustments as it came in. His parents were amazed. "You need to show this to your teachers right away," said Rupert. But Tigrid declined. He said he was getting straight A's anyway and didn't want to be a show-off. They didn't completely agree, but they had the sense they had gotten a rare glimpse into one of the far chambers of their son's mind and should be careful. Rupert was just glad it wasn't occupied by, quote, emergent psychopathic narcissism. He felt a flash of anger at Dr. Tombrock when he thought of that, but forgave him immediately. Only a final release from that worry gave him the luxury to turn the years of anxiety about it against the doctor. But instead of nurturing it, he let it float away like a puff of smoke. And after all, at the time the doctor might have been right. Tigrid, he said, "That's humblingly humble." Tigrid smiled and gazed upon his creation. MIT camp. Although it was late to apply, his parents offered to splurge for him to go to an advanced science and engineering camp at MIT. Tigrid was enthusiastic. Rupert and Annabelle were concerned only that he wouldn't make friends. "Don't forget you can make connections at a camp like that you might need later in life," said Rupert. "That means making friends." Tigrid nodded. "Think of it as a project." Tigrid shrugged. "Just don't have too much fun." Tigrid gave him a confused look, and Rupert winced. It was a lame joke and made no sense. He knew that if Tigrid could formulate the words, he would say, "Fun and projects are the same thing." "Just try to learn a lot." "I will." The Schauts found out very quickly this wasn't the kind of camp open to anyone with a tuition check. But there had been a late dropout, and though there was already a waiting list, they gave Tigrid the space. He was the youngest one there, and they put him with a roommate who was second youngest, a 17-year-old Czech kid whose name, Jiří, was Tigrid's first challenge. Jiří was also interested in self-flying drones, and they were up late every night talking about them and a million other things until their minds collapsed. Tigrid struggled. Everyone else seemed smarter by far, which he found terrifying yet invigorating. Each day was so full of new information that it seemed to have no such thing as a duration. A little like his gray summer, but full of light, and it felt over before it began. After camp, Jiří seemed like a ghost to him, and he would remark to himself then and throughout his life how strange it was that they never met again. Even his odd name slowly evaporated into time. Tigrid did not feel transformed by the experience, other than that it gave him an increased interest in coding and a stated goal of going to MIT for college. But his parents noticed a change. He seemed settled and circumspect, as if he were traveling through time much slower than everyone else. His movements were a shade slower, and his responses more thoughtful. Each utterance had the sound of polished prose. Each motion was deliberate and efficient. Even his typing sounded less like sporadic clicking and more like a well-paced march. His study of coding took him through a list of hefty tomes, which he moved from one side of his desk to the other as he mastered them. "One day," he announced, "when I'm finished with the basics, I'll have to go on alone. No one else will be able to help me." Rupert answered, "That's not often true. There's always someone out there who can do some things better. Just think of Captain Stockton." "Not for this. It will be 2 years until I'm finished, but I can see the end. I know what I'm doing." Rupert and Annabelle took that as at least some breathing space. It would be 2 years until, well, what, they didn't know. But at least it was 2 years. He spent long hours with the computer and his drones, and his parents willingly fed him money to keep doing whatever he was doing. If they asked about what he was learning, he could easily fob them off with the best antidote to curiosity of them all, the truth. He would give them an exhaustive description of what he was working on until their brains felt pickled, and they asked less and less often. About everyday things, he still talked, but he was detached. This would change when he would talk to Captain Stockton online. Suddenly, he would reanimate. His voice would be relaxed and loose. His movements would be natural and spontaneous. They had to admit to themselves some jealousy on this point, but did not express it. They felt an increasing desperation to get him to talk, to let them take part in his thoughts. But since that day in the field with the plane that could take off by itself, they felt like they had been kept politely in the front hall of his mind. Closing in on the real world. High school started, and Tigrid managed that transition without any more problems than middle school. Many of the kids were the same, and he had an inner confidence that no high school dramas could shake. He continued to outstrip his parents, peers, and teachers in knowledge of computers and robotics. Rupert and Annabelle had taken a hands-off approach with him, except in one instance. One tax season, Rupert noticed that his bank had not been making automatic insurance payments for several months. He had called the companies to ask why he hadn't been informed, but they said he was up to date, which left only one logical possibility: Tigrid. When questioned, Tigrid simply said, "I took care of it." "You can't do that, Tigrid. The rates in California are a rip-off, Dad." "It's illegal." "The fees are what should be illegal. I'm still working on the registration and license fees. Those are even worse. The state doesn't need all that money for a license. You pay enough in taxes already." Rupert thought for a moment how his taxes were all on the computer. "Tigrid, you can't..." Tigrid cut him off. "It's easy. California has zero security. It just takes time. Getting a bona fide inspection sticker will be a challenge, though. It's illegal. That's all there is to it. I don't want you to break the law." There's a difference between illegal and wrong. The founders knew what freedom was. Man's law does not confer freedom. "Do you know the damage you can do to your reputation? Do you think MIT will let in a kid who hacks websites for money?" Tigrid looked at him long enough to make it a stare. Suddenly, he blinked and turned his head away, saying, "That's your choice, I guess." Rupert returned to paying his insurance and the fees. Tigrid was more detached than ever. His peers and teachers did not find him unfriendly or antagonistic, but his indifference to them felt like a lurking threat. They didn't think he had real friends, and he did not try to get a girlfriend, something which bothered Annabelle most of all. She began to regret that they had had only one child. Rupert consoled her that it wasn't unusual. They hadn't met until late in college, after all. Get a smaller basket. They started to worry that he was depressed, and they felt helpless to change him. They contacted Dr. Tombrock, who said he would be happy to see him, but that it might upset him. He didn't think Tigrid was showing concerning signs of depression just yet, and it was common for teenagers to go through funny phases. He also advocated against medications, which they agreed with. Pills would never go well with Tigrid. They fell into a routine of irresolution that, as the years of high school progressed, eventually felt normal. His rebellion was probably independence, they thought. Tigrid presented no drastic problems, and he got top grades. He spent a week or two with the Stocktons each summer and came back with renewed purpose each time. He may have been distant, but he was not angry, disrespectful, or moody. They went to Dr. Tombrock a few times, just themselves. He told them that children grow up their own way. You have to accept them for who they are and take what love you can get. If you don't think it's filling your basket, he said, get a smaller basket. It seemed to them Tigrid would always be a casserole of resentments and a shaman of impenetrable mysteries, at least in part, and if so, God bless him. Soon he would leave their threshold for the last time, not physically, but mentally, and they didn't want to drive him away any faster than necessary. But they felt like the forlorn timekeepers counting down to the final hour before sunset.